with Gbagbo now in detention, we'll ask who finally captured him and why is Paris so keen to insist it was Ivorian forces who seized the former president. Welcome to The Hub. Our top story, Laurent Gbagbo's tenure as the Ivorian president is over. He's now been arrested. He's in detention at the Gulf Hotel. That's the base for his rival, Alassane Ouattara's forces. We're going to show you the moment that 11 years as president came to a close. He had been in his residence. These pictures are either in his residence or they were taken and filmed already with him inside the Gulf Hotel. His minders there deciding, or his entourage deciding rather, that the shirt he had on isn't good enough. He mops his brow with a proffered towel and then puts on a slightly different shirt before he then begins that process. This that you're looking at now, I suppose, is the end game to a process, or a punctuation mark to a process that started back in November when we had those contested presidential election results. Although, in fairness to Mr. Gbagbo, we should state, of course, there was a sizable chunk of the population did vote for him. They did want him as president. Now, these forces reportedly went in after French tanks advanced on the compound in Ivory Coast's main city, Abidjan, following French and UN helicopter attacks. Our correspondent, Mark Doyle, is there for The Hub. Mark, just take us through what we think happened just in the past couple of hours.
Well, what appears to have happened is that the French, well, we know that the French and the United Nations helicopter gunships last night were blasting away at Mr. Gbagbo's residence. And then this morning, French forces left this French military base where I am, a huge column of them, and they occupied a road called, appropriately enough, the Boulevard de France, which is near to Mr. Gbagbo's residence. Then French forces went down side roads towards Mr. Gbagbo's residence. And then the dispute starts as to exactly what happened. The French say that they secured the area and that then Mr. Ouattara's people arrested Mr. Gbagbo and took him to the Gulf Hotel. And those pictures, I think, that you were showing there with the yellow walls. Sorry, there's a helicopter about to go above me here. That's the United Nations helicopter gunship, which is just flying off in a mission. Two of them are in the sky at the moment. The UN has two helicopter gunships here. Those yellow walls are, I believe, the Gulf Hotel, a room in the Gulf Hotel. So that picture will have been taken by Ouattara's people after he'd been arrested, after he'd been taken to the Gulf Hotel. But to go back to this dispute, exactly who arrested him. The French say that they secured the area and then Mr. Ouattara's people arrested him. But Mr. Gbagbo's supporters say it was French special forces who arrested him. Now, this is politically very significant because if it was the French who arrested him, for one thing, the French will be accused of acting in a neo-colonial way in this former colony, and Mr. Gbagbo's supporters, those that remain, will accuse Mr. Ouattara of having come to power only because of foreign forces and therefore being a puppet of the outside.
Briefly, Mark, what's the reaction on the streets been like?
Quite muted, actually. There have been some car horns being sounded and so on, but I've just spoken to a friend of mine who lives in a sort of broadly pro-Ouattara area, and he said people aren't going out even though they're generally Ouattara supporters because they don't want to get caught by some of these militias who are still around, who were armed a few days ago by Mr. Gbagbo.
OK, Mark Doyle, our correspondent there live in Abidjan for The Hub. Thanks very much. A little later here on The Hub, we'll try to work out what happens to Mr. Gbagbo next and what this means for the country. But before that, our World Affairs correspondent Peter Biles looks back now on the political life of Ivory Coast's incumbent president, former president, Laurent Gbagbo. His report does contain some flash photography.
Laurent Gbagbo, the man at the heart of Ivorian politics for the last decade. His roots were in the trade union movement, but he was also one of the first to challenge Ivory Coast's founding father, President Félix Houphouët-Boigny, who eventually opened the country to multi-party politics in 1990. Laurent Gbagbo became president in the year 2000, after a chaotic period of political transition. 2 years later, after a failed coup attempt, his government faced a rebellion in the north. It led to civil war and a virtual partition of the country. It was a foretaste of what was to come. Gbagbo declared the war over in 2007, but the presidential elections that were then planned didn't take place until the end of last year. The voting went to a second round as Gbagbo was challenged by a long-time opponent, Alassane Ouattara. He was declared the winner. Laurent Gbagbo's supporters disputed it, and the incumbent president stood firm, in spite of the welter of international opinion against him. The fighting of the last few months was largely because Laurent Gbagbo stubbornly refused to cede power. Ivory Coast has again been left traumatized by violence and conflict, and it's all a far cry from the model West African state which this once was. Peter Biles, BBC News.
We will go back to that as and when we get some more concrete evidence out of the UN, but we'll stay at the UN in New York and we'll talk to our correspondent there, Barbara Plett. Barbara, what does the UN want to happen next?
Well, I was speaking to the Secretary General just a few minutes ago, and he said that there were a number of things the UN had to be involved in. One was, together with President Ouattara's forces and government, needing to address urgently the severe humanitarian crisis in the country, and also to help restore law and order, which is very much a priority at this stage. He said that the safety of Laurent Gbagbo should be protected. It was up to President Ouattara what to do with him, but he said the UN would be in close coordination with Mr. Ouattara about this. We've also heard from the head of UN peacekeeping, Alain Leroy. He said that Mr. Gbagbo had indeed requested security protection from UN forces, and the UN was protecting him. He was under the custody of President Ouattara, but the UN was protecting him in the Gulf Hotel, which is Mr. Ouattara's headquarters. He said that most of the fighting had died down. There were pockets of resistance still. He said that a main general of Mr. Gbagbo had said that he wanted his forces to surrender, and Mr. Leroy was hopeful this would happen. This was also mentioned last week, and it didn't happen, but he said he thought 200 soldiers had surrendered their arms.
What are they expecting those Gbagbo supporters to do next?
I think it's all very much up in the air. I mean, the hoped-for scenario is the one that Mr. Leroy was talking about, that the forces would surrender and they would hand their arms into the UN. That was a scenario that Mr. Gbagbo's top three generals suggested last week. Now, it turned out that that was a ruse, a trick, as Mr. Leroy called it, for Gbagbo to dig in his forces and actually put up more of a fight. Now that he has actually been arrested, it seems the scenario is playing itself out again to some degree, and they guess the UN is going to wait and see how that goes. He also said, Mr. Leroy, that President Ouattara's forces, the police, the national police, and others, together with the UN troops, did need to work together to provide law and order. But of course, the concern is that Mr. Gbagbo's forces, and pockets of them anyway, will not want to lay down their arms and will continue to create there will continue to be violence despite the fact that Mr. Gbagbo has surrendered.
Now, within that equation of people all working together, is anyone there asking any questions about what the French have done? Not perhaps what they've done, but how they've done it. They seem to have been pushing the diplomatic envelope in certain ways.
The questions here have been more about the UN's role. Now, the UN forces were working with the support of French forces according to the Security Council mandate. And Mr. Leroy, as well as the Secretary General, said that the decision to launch the airstrikes, which at face value anyway, appeared to have softened things up further for the eventual arrest of Mr. Gbagbo, were taken strictly according to the mandate of the UN, which is to take out heavy weapons that are targeting civilians. Mr. Leroy said that decision was taken especially on Saturday because Mr. Gbagbo's forces hit Ouattara's hotel, and so that's why they retaliated. He said that he insisted that the UN and French forces had gone in to take out heavy weapons and that it was President Ouattara's forces which had arrested Mr. Gbagbo.
Barbara Plett, live at the UN in New York for The Hub. Barbara, thanks very much. We'll be live in Paris for you as well a little later here on The Hub, asking more questions about the French involvement and, ideally, the relationship where it goes now between France and Ivory Coast.